Welcome to Gate City Insider. I'm Rosemary Plybon. Every February, we take time to recognize the countless African Americans who have impacted our history and our lives today. Leaders, entrepreneurs, scientists, artists, dreamers, athletes, men, women, and children, all of whom have made a difference. During Black History Month, we celebrate many who called Greensboro home at some time in their lives, including 4 local college students who 60 years ago this month started a movement that would spread outside Greensboro, spread outside North Carolina, spread across the country, and would truly spark change. John Swaine is CEO of the International Civil Rights Center and Museum here in Greensboro. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for the invitation, Rosemary.
Really appreciate it. And of course, that is the space where you work every day.
Yes.
Hallowed ground, really, where this sit-in movement started. So let's take a little trip back in time, 60 years ago, and let's talk about those 4 young men.
Sure.
Ziel Brell, Jabril Kazan, as he's known now, David Richmond, Joseph McNeil, and Franklin McCain.
Yes.
Tell me a little bit about those 4 at that time.
At that time, they were just ordinary citizens doing heroic things.
Both.
Yes,
Both, yeah.
actually. These were students who had studied the U.S. Constitution in their classes at A&T, and they understood what it meant to live in a country where people were afforded decency and dignity. And so they had gotten to the point where enough was enough. And so they kicked off what would become one of the most phenomenal occurrences of the time.
They were freshmen.
They were
freshmen at A&T.
Yes, they were. And very bright freshmen at that, very bright freshmen. All had promising careers ahead of them. One was not able to fully exercise what he had learned at North Carolina A&T, but the other 3, they truly benefited. I think in some respects, their actions was held against them for a good while, but they were able to find a way to push on through it.
So let's talk about their actions, because the night it was actually January 31st,
yes.
and they were together, and they had decided they were going to go to the Woolworths store, and they were going to sit at the counter and order lunch.
They knew that it was a dangerous thing to do as well, but they understood the power of the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which was ratified in 1868. They knew that they were afforded full and equal protection under the law as any other citizens in our country. Therefore, to suffer the indecency of having to walk into a Woolworths, spend your money on toothpaste and other toiletries and everything else that Woolworths sold, but not be able to go and sit at the F.W. Woolworths lunch counter was just more than they could take. And I think they had reached that tipping point where it was time. I don't know how any student can sit in a college classroom and study the Declaration of Independence, the U.S. Constitution, and not fully think about what it means. And they pushed that forward that day.
And so they decided the next day, February 1st, they would go to the Woolworths, as we said. They talked about, I've had a chance to interview 3 of them before, and they talked about, they were nervous. They were scared that night. They were worried what the repercussions would be from doing this.
Their families were also, would also suffer repercussions because during that time, you were to keep your children in line, all things in decency and in order. And here in this town, decency and in order was Black folks pick up your meals and go out on the street. White folks could sit at the F.W. Woolworth lunch counter in the eyes of some. But that wasn't enough for these students.
So they sat down, and of course they were refused service.
They were.
They didn't leave, though.
They did not. They sat until the store closed that day.
But they didn't riot. They didn't make they sat there. They sat.
No. They asserted their 14th Amendment rights that day. And I look back at that time and I ask myself, looking forward 60 years, just looking forward 10 years, what were they really thinking the world would really be like? And as we kick off our anniversary, looking back 60 years from now, I'm looking forward to connecting with a couple of them
Yeah.
to ask that question.
Right. So, can you explain in the context of the time what was unique about what they did sitting there quietly?
Yes. The unique thing was they went against the social order. They weren't expected to be there, but I think they felt that it was natural for them to just go over and sit down at the F.W. Woolworth's lunch counter. And most people would never have thought that they would go against the social norms.
February 2nd, what happened that day?
On February 2nd, those students returned, and they brought more students with them. And the next day, and the next day, and the next day, and it continued on.
And then it spread outside of
And
Greensboro.
yes, it
Actually,
did.
pretty quickly spread outside of
It did.
Greensboro.
It was, the word was carried by newspaper, the word was carried by the rail stations. People were chatting away about what was taking place at Woolworth's. So yes, it did spread quite quickly.
So word spread and then action spread. What did that look like?
And the actions was student protests across the South to bring about changes at the Woolworth lunch counters and other segregated lunch counters. And it wasn't until 1963 that Jesse Jackson would lead a desegregation effort at the Crest lunch counter. So it still continues to reverberate.
So, and then really change started really over the next couple of months. It started.
Yes.
The Civil Rights Act of 1960 signed in May. Why was
Absolutely.
that significant?
That was significant because there were so many people being denied the right to vote. There was so many bombs going off in Birmingham, and the president moved to enact that law to prevent people from being harmed because they did have those rights.
And then in July 1960, Woolworth integrated the Greensboro store.
July 25th, to be exact. The students from Dudley, when the college students would go home for the summer, I think people thought that, okay,
This'll
heat's
die
off.
down.
But the high school students came every single day and continued that protest until the lunch counter was desegregated July 25th of 1960.
We see a lot of pictures and media coverage from that time. The A&T4, you know, the classic picture in the News and Record walking down the street.
Yes.
Photos later of more students sitting at the lunch counter than just the four of them. And from the pictures, it doesn't really tell the whole story, I think we should say.
It truly doesn't. And I think that's why a lot of people like to look at the second day photograph of four African American men sitting at a lunch counter. That is one of the misconceptions that we constantly have to clear up when people come in. The image of the four men outside of the store at the end of the day on the first day, that photograph was taken by a photographer from News and Record, Jack Mobies. But we have to pull people back to that's the photograph of the A&T4. The second day, only two of those men were featured in that photograph.
And then more students came, and they were at the
Yes,
counter. They were
yes.
outside on the street. It was a movement.
Yes, it was. And each year when we have students that walk to the museum from A&T and from some of the other schools, I stand there in amazement of what it must have been like during that time. All of the noise, the chatter, the excitement of wanting to come in and take your seat at the F.W. Woolworth's lunch counter.
When did these students, the four and the others who started to join them, when did they realize that what they were doing was making a difference, that they had started something?
I think they realized that it was going to make a difference on January 31st.
Before they started.
Prior to that, the students at Bennett, the women at Bennett, had also met with them over a number of days and talked about planning this action. And it was my understanding that the four men jumped the gun and came on down to the counter. They may have just come in to check out the lay of the land, but they
decided
saw
to
the
sit.
opportunity, let's go for it, and went on over to sit down. So I think it was at that point, as they sat there, They weren't arrested. Even when the police
Right.
officer came,
They said they're not doing
it
anything
clicked
wrong.
in that they had full and equal protection under the law as guaranteed by the 14th Amendment. And that's one of the most powerful amendments in our country right now.
So could they have known, though, that it would spread like it did, that it would go so far?
I don't
and
think that
we'd be talking about it today,
I
60
don't
years
think
later.
that they had really imagined that. I really don't think that they had imagined that it was going to spread the way that it did. But once it started happening and word was getting back and forth with the rail system and so forth in the newspaper articles that were coming out, they realized that they were making an impact, a very powerful impact around the country.
And it worked. It did. So
Yes,
in
it did.
1993, the Greensboro War store closed.
Yes.
And part of the lunch counter went to the Smithsonian. Part of it went to the Greensboro History Museum.
Yes.
And then the building, largely the rest of the counter, sat and gathered
Yes,
dust for a
yes,
while.
it did.
Can you talk about how that began to change and the vision for what it is now began to grow?
As I learned more about it myself, and I found that the two co-founders, Melvin Skip Alston and Earl F. Jones, heard that the building was going to be acquired and demolished. They understood the power of what happened here in this city. And they met with others and decided that they wanted to acquire the property and turn it into a civil rights museum. So they sought to seek some loans and some financing and donations to build a world-class museum. We are now through the first phase or the second phase of all of that. There is still plenty of opportunity to grow this institution so that we can continue to bring people to Greensboro. But that's something that they saw. I think it's a little bit more than what they envisioned.
Of course.
I think they're quite amazed every time they walk into the door and they see the crowds coming from all over the world to visit.
And in fact, we're at the 10th anniversary of opening day, which is February 1st, 2010.
Yes.
An amazing day for the museum, amazing day for Greensboro, really.
It truly is. I think it bodes well for this community that we have managed to bring this museum through an economic downturn.
It was a tough
many businesses folded during that time, but we were able to lean into it and come on through, and a lot of people made very significant investments, and I didn't want to let them down.
Right. Time, money.
Oh, a
all
lot
of
of
that.
time.
Yes.
A lot of time.
Yes. All right, we're going to talk with you some more. We're going to
Sure.
learn more about Greensboro's place in civil rights history. We're going to learn more about the museum, how it is, what's the same, what has changed in the past 10 years, and we will be back, so stay right here with us. Welcome back to Gate City Insider. Today we have with us John Swaine, who's the CEO of the International Civil Rights Center and Museum here in Greensboro. And he's sharing a lot with us about Greensboro's civil rights history, a rich history. And we think about the A&T 4. I mean, everybody learns about them in school, and that comes sort of easy in some ways. But there are so many other notable African Americans who called Greensboro home at some time or another, and we just wanted to kind of talk about a few of them because you can learn about them at the museum.
Absolutely.
And many, many more,
Absolutely.
but I'm just going to run through some names and you kind of tell me your thoughts on them and their importance. Henry Fry.
Justice Fry is a very important member of this community. One of the first black justices for the North Carolina Supreme Court. He tends to visit the museum on a pretty regular basis, and it's always an opportunity to learn something from him.
And his picture hangs in the museum.
His picture and his robe hangs in the
that's right,
museum, so yes.
Great thing to learn about. Elretta Alexander Ralston. She has a lot of first next to her name.
That is somebody I'm not totally familiar with. at
So
this time.
first admitted to Columbia Law School, first African-American woman to graduate from the law school, to practice law in North Carolina, to argue North Carolina in front of the North Carolina Supreme Court. So that's another, I mean, lots of firsts by her name.
There are many people, and as I spend more time with this museum, I'm learning about a lot of folks who were very powerful in the movement, and those are our unsung heroes, and there are plenty of opportunities for us to expand our knowledge of them.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because it's not all, I mean, as we learned with ANT4, it's not all adults who have, who have made their career and then come back to help.
Yes.
For instance, Josephine Boyd, and we now have Josephine
Yes,
Boyd
yes.
named after the street in Greensboro now.
And she helped to integrate one of the local schools here. I've
Grimsley High
met many
School,
of her
yeah.
family members at the museum, so
She was the
yes,
first
yes.
African-American student to attend desegregated Grimsley
Yes,
High School. And in
Grimsley.
fact, Greensboro was one of the first in the Southeast to desegregate schools.
and I didn't realize that until reading about the history
Right.
a couple of months ago. So that speaks well for the area.
John Demery escaped slavery via the Greensboro Underground Railroad. Let's see, Martin Luther King Jr. came to Bennett College to
Yes.
speak.
Yes, he did. And a lot of folks I talked to today, they still remember that powerful moment. As a matter of fact, two of our honorees that we're going to have at our upcoming gala were present when he came to Bennett to speak.
And of course, that was before the famous March on Washington.
Yes,
that
it
was. And what I read about that was that, in fact, the organizers had a hard time finding somewhere for him to speak initially. And Bennett's president said, yes, we want him here. And it was an overflowing crowd. They had speakers in the quad so people could hear outside.
Yeah, there wasn't a lot of support for him, and people were concerned about backlash.
Right.
But Bennett did, Willoughby Player did step forward and say, yes, we'll take him. That was a good decision.
It was a good decision. Another young person, Claude Barnes.
Dr. Barnes, I think his daughter has worked with us a number of times on different projects, but I don't think I've had an opportunity to really get into his history fully. But
he was up for he was on the write-in ballot at Dudley, and people wrote in his name, and then they declared someone else the winner, a white student, and so protests came up, and then they changed it and made him student body president. So it was a change, and then I mean, they're just, the names go on, and really, the sit-in movement dominates our conversation, of course, in Greensboro. But there's so much more in there. There are good things that happened here. There are not so good things that are difficult to talk about. And this has good and bad. Warnersville neighborhood, North Carolina's first heritage community, which was largely destroyed, and most of the historic homes there from urban renewal, which was called at the time.
Yes.
But there are so many people who live there and share and know the history and share the story, and it really is becoming a vibrant community once again.
And it's almost a double-edged sword. If a municipality doesn't go in to a community and update the housing and make living conditions better, people are kind of angry about those things. When a community is demolished and replaced, we do lose history. But there are very important portions of our assets in the city that you definitely need to protect. So I've heard quite a bit about Warnersville.
Yes.
I'm a transplant to this area, so
We're
trying
glad
to come
to
up
have you.
trying to come up to speed quickly
Yes,
on everybody and
you're getting
everything.
it. You're doing great. Of course, Bennett College in
Absolutely.
itself
Yes.
started in 1873.
And that's quite powerful in its own right, to think that during those times in the 1800s, when African Americans could barely have a decent home or an education, that someone would forge an alliance to build a very nice campus for people, young men and women, to come and learn. So it's to our benefit
Yes.
to see to its well-being even in today. So.
North Carolina A&T, of course,
Yes.
speaks for itself.
Most definitely. The thing I love most about A&T it graduates the most African American CPAs. And so it's the CPAs, not the engineers, that are close to my heart. But
He's a business
I was
background.
quite pleased to learn that they are one of the largest African American institutions, and that they graduated a high number of CPAs.
And they continue to just graduate
Yes.
young men and women who are doing amazing things. And
Absolutely.
we just hope to keep as many of them here in Greensboro as we possibly can.
That is another problem, yes.
Yes. Well, why is it important to keep talking about these people, our history, these events?
These folks are reminders of who we were as a people. Not necessarily who we are today or who we aspire to be tomorrow, but they remind us of where we've come from. They remind us of the great struggles that have occurred in our country. And I think it is worthy of us to continue to remember them and appreciate their contributions to U.S. history.
And we can really do this at the museum, which is
Absolutely.
a wonderful place to do it. Can you talk about the best way to explore the museum?
One of the best ways to explore this museum is with a guided tour. We have self-guided tours that start Monday through Friday from 2 until close, but those are not the tours that I tend to favor. The guided tours are quite engaging. They can go quite deeply. Most folks that have visited and want to go on a self-guided tour, they walk through it in 15 minutes. It's like they are not able to really pull it all together and understand what we are about. So I think the best way to see this museum is through a guided tour with a docent.
And what will you see?
You're going to see the ugliest part of our U.S. history. You're going to see some of the deliberations on January 31st of 1960 with the A&T4. We then take you to the lunch counter. We take you into the battlegrounds to talk about living conditions of African Americans. What was that response to their living conditions back during the Jim Crow South, Jim Crow era? We take you into the church and into the educational galleries, politics in the voting booth. And my favorite piece of the museum is direct action. You know, how did change really come about? Nonviolent change came about because people spoke with their pocketbook. They spoke with their feet. They walked to work. They didn't endure the indignities of riding in the back of a bus or being requested to enter a back of a restaurant. They just didn't frequent those places. But when we close out our tour, we remind people that there is hope. You and I are both part of that change if we want to build a better world.
When we look at the museum 10 years ago and today, what has changed and what has stayed the same?
What has changed? Well, let's start with what has stayed the same. Our permanent exhibit that we spent a huge amount of money having curated, it's been one of the best. Other museums come here on a regular basis when they are thinking about putting museums in their own backyards. And when I show up for the pre-openings, I see a lot of our same material. But that exhibit, there are places that are going to require some updating. But those things require a lot of resources. So we talk our guests through that. The things that have changed, we have rotating exhibits on a regular basis. They're quite expensive, but I usually try to find ways to segregate some funds to cover new exhibits that we can bring in. We've also curated our own exhibits from time to time. I am fortunate enough to say that we have a very talented staff of people. They have an institutional enthusiasm that's unmatched by most other organizations, and it's kind of nice to come in and know that you can turn something over to a group of people and they're going to make something educational out of it. So I hire a lot of retired educators. Other things that have changed at the museum is flexibility in our staffing. We try to provide the best workplace possible, and self-guided tours. We've put self-guided tours, and a lot of people wanted self-guided tours. I think that in the next year, probably this year, I will be looking to acquire some equipment so that people can have an audio guided tour. It's a little on the pricey side, so I've written a couple of grants to try to get some support for that. But I think with our growing tourism, and that is another thing that has changed. We have seen a huge number of people come into the downtown area, and I love the fact that we're able to help drive economic activity to other small businesses up and down the street. So there's been quite a bit that has changed over the last couple of years.
I know this is a busy month, February, with anniversary of the museum opening, with, of course, the 60th anniversary of the sit-in beginning. And what things are going on at the museum?
Well, we're going to kick off February with our gala, where we're going to honor some pioneers in civil rights and civil rights activists. We have some new exhibits that are going to be opening. We opened one on King just a couple of days ago. There is going to be a poetry reading this coming Friday with North Carolina poet laureate Jackie Shelton Green. And we have a number of other programs that are going to be lined up for the month of February. And the best way to stay attuned to those things is to go to our website and sign up to get our news announcements. But we will have an exhibit on the Green Book that will soon be coming. And I'm working with the Beloved Center to take a look at how we move forward with the 1979 Greensboro Massacre. Since they celebrated their 40th anniversary just last year, one of the things that I said to that I would do is work with them on designing an exhibit. I've seen an artistic exhibit that they had. We're going to bring the artists in, update the paintings, and talk about how we move forward as a community and just recognize, again, that's who we were. That's not who we are today.
And who we want to be.
And who we want to be. We want to be a better place and a better world.
And that's what we hope people take with them when they think about Black History Month, when they visit the International Civil Rights Center and Museum, when they think about Greensboro's history in civil rights and our future.
I think many people that walk out of a museum, they're quite impressed by the way that the whole tour wraps up on a very positive note with hope. And there's a lot of that to go around. Yes, we've lived through a very turbulent time, but it doesn't have to be who we are next year.
That's right. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me.
Really nice to have you here today. The International Civil Rights Center and Museum is at 134 South Elm Street, that same building that housed the Woolworths department store and the lunch counter where those 4 A&T students made history by quietly taking a seat at the lunch counter. Find out more, as he said, and stay up to date by signing up to get updates on their website. It is sitinmovement.org. And we'll see you next time.